On the morning of December 22, 1997, 45 people lay dead inside and around a small church in the village of Acteal, Chiapas, Mexico. 36 of them were women and children. All were indigenous Tzotzil Maya, members of a pacifist Catholic organization called Las Abejas, the Bees. The method: systematic execution with high-powered rifles while the victims prayed for peace during a religious fast. The perpetrators, approximately 60 members of a paramilitary group called Máscara Roja, Red Mask, armed, trained, and supported by local and state government authorities. The Mexican government would try to classify it as intercommunal violence, as indigenous people killing each other over land disputes that were tragically common in Chiapas. But the evidence told a different story. It told of a state-sponsored paramilitary operation designed to terrorize communities sympathetic to Zapatista demands for indigenous autonomy. It told of Army units stationed 200 meters away who heard the shooting and did nothing. It told of a massacre carried out in a church during prayer against people whose only crime was refusing to abandon their land and their demand for justice. And it told of 45 bodies, including 15 children, some still infants, left on a hillside as a message about what happened when indigenous communities challenged Mexico's political and economic order. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that expose the Mexican government's strategy of using paramilitary forces to suppress indigenous movements, and revealed how easily massacre could be disguised as ethnic conflict when the state wanted to avoid accountability for political violence. Chiapas is Mexico's southernmost state, bordering Guatemala, covering approximately 73,000 square kilometers of mountains, jungle, and highland plateaus. In 1997, the state was home to roughly 3.9 million people, about 30% of them indigenous Maya, Tzotzil, Tzeltal, Chol, Tojolabal, and other groups who'd inhabited the region for over 2,000 years. The geography was extreme, mountains rising to 4,000 meters in the highlands region, dense tropical rainforest in the Lacandon jungle to the east, fertile valleys where coffee and corn were cultivated on land that had been fought over for centuries. Chiapas was Mexico's richest state in natural resources and its poorest in almost every measure of human development. The state produced hydroelectric power, petroleum, coffee, cacao, and timber that enriched corporations and government, but left indigenous communities in desperate poverty. In 1997, approximately 60% of Chiapas residents lacked access to potable water, 40% lived in homes with dirt floors, and indigenous communities had infant mortality rates comparable to the poorest countries in Africa. This wasn't underdevelopment. This was extraction, a system where indigenous labor and indigenous land generated wealth that flowed to Mexico City and foreign investors, while communities that produced that wealth remained in conditions resembling feudalism. The village of Acteal sat in the highlands region of Chiapas in the municipality of Chenalho, about 20 kilometers north of the city of San Cristobal de las Casas. Acteal was tiny, population around 300, scattered across a hillside where subsistence farmers grew corn and beans on small plots, raised chickens and a few pigs, lived in houses made of wood planks and corrugated metal roofs. The community was Tzotzil Maya, speaking Tzotzil as their first language, Spanish as a poorly learned second language that schools barely taught and government officials demanded. December in Chiapas highlands meant cold nights and mild days, temperatures ranging from 5 degrees Celsius at dawn to 20 degrees by afternoon. The air at that elevation, around 1,800 meters, was thin, crisp, smelling like pine smoke from cooking fires and the rich earth of recently harvested cornfields. Fog rolled through the mountains most mornings, burning off by 9 or 10 a.m. to reveal views across valleys where indigenous communities had lived in essentially the same way for centuries, isolated by geography and by deliberate government neglect that kept indigenous regions underdeveloped and powerless. But December 1997 wasn't just another season in rural Chiapas. The state had been in low-intensity civil war since January 1, 1994, when the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, EZLN, had launched an uprising timed to coincide with the implementation of NAFTA. The Zapatistas, indigenous rebels named after revolutionary hero Emiliano Zapata, had seized several towns in Chiapas, declared war on the Mexican government, and demanded indigenous autonomy, land reform, and an end to the exploitation that had characterized indigenous life in Chiapas for 5 centuries. The uprising had shocked Mexico and the world. Indigenous people weren't supposed to rebel, especially not with such sophisticated political messaging and media strategy. The Mexican military had responded with overwhelming force, killing hundreds in the first 2 weeks, but international pressure had forced a ceasefire by January 12, 1994. Since then, Chiapas had existed in a state of suspended conflict, the Zapatistas controlling territory in the jungle and some highland regions, the government controlling cities and major roads, and everyone in between trying to survive in the space where politics and violence overlapped. By 1997, the government's strategy had evolved. Instead of direct military confrontation with the Zapatistas, which generated bad press and international condemnation, the strategy was to use paramilitary groups, local indigenous people armed and trained by military and police, paid by government, organized to attack communities sympathetic to Zapatista demands. The paramilitaries did the dirty work of counterinsurgency while the government maintained plausible deniability, claiming that violence in Chiapas was intercommunal conflict, indigenous groups fighting over land and resources, tragic but not the government's fault. The paramilitary strategy was effective because it was confusing. When indigenous people killed other indigenous people, it looked like ethnic conflict rather than state violence. International observers struggled to understand the dynamics. Media coverage portrayed Chiapas as a complex situation with violence on many sides, obscuring the reality that paramilitaries were state proxies carrying out counterinsurgency operations. And in December 1997, that strategy was about to produce one of the most horrific massacres in modern Mexican history. Las Abejas, the Bees, was founded in 1992, 2 years before the Zapatista uprising, as a Catholic pacifist organization dedicated to indigenous rights, social justice, and nonviolent resistance to government oppression. The organization took its name from the idea that bees work collectively, that their strength comes from organization, and that, like bees defending their hive, indigenous communities needed to defend their rights, but could do so without violence. Las Abejas had deep roots in liberation theology, the strain of Catholic thinking that emerged in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, emphasizing the Church's obligation to serve the poor and challenge unjust social structures. The organization was influenced by Bishop Samuel Ruiz Garcia of the Diocese of San Cristobal de las Casas, who'd spent decades working with indigenous communities, learning their languages, advocating for their rights, and training indigenous catechists who combined Catholic teaching with traditional Maya spirituality and political consciousness about exploitation and injustice. By 1997, Las Abejas had approximately 10,000 members across the Chiapas highlands, mostly Tzotzil and Celtal Maya, organized in small community groups that met for prayer, Bible study, and discussion of how to resist government oppression without using violence. The organization was explicitly pacifist. Members refused to carry weapons, refused to join either the Zapatistas or the paramilitaries, insisted that change had to come through peaceful means, through moral witness, through suffering if necessary, but never through violence. This pacifism made Las Abejas suspect to everyone. The Zapatistas viewed them as naive, believing that the government would only respond to armed pressure. The government viewed them as Zapatista sympathizers, hiding behind religious rhetoric. The paramilitaries viewed them as traitors who refused to defend the PRI, the institutional revolutionary party that had governed Mexico for 68 consecutive years, and which maintained control in rural Chiapas through a combination of patronage, corruption, intimidation, and violence. The leader of Las Abejas in Acteal was a man named Alonso Vázquez Gomez, 52 years old in December 1997, a farmer who'd worked the same plot of land his entire life, growing barely enough corn to feed his family of 7. Alonso stood about 5'4", the average height for Tzotzil men of his generation who'd grown up malnourished, with the lean, weathered build of someone who'd done physical labor from childhood. He spoke Tzotzil fluently, Spanish with difficulty, had maybe 3 years of formal education total, but he was literate in ways that mattered, could read the Bible in Spanish, understood the political dynamics that kept his community poor, could articulate demands for justice in terms that combined indigenous worldview with Catholic social teaching. What Alonso valued most was dignity, not wealth, he had none, not political power, he held no office, dignity. The sense that indigenous people deserved to be treated as human beings, created in God's image, that poverty wasn't natural or inevitable, but the result of systems designed to exploit indigenous labor, and that resistance to those systems was not only justified, but morally required. By December 1997, Alonso had been receiving death threats for over a year. Paramilitaries had warned him that Las Abejas needed to disband, that communities needed to declare loyalty to the PRI, that refusing to choose sides meant choosing to die. Alonso refused. He believed absolutely in nonviolence, believed that moral witness would eventually triumph, that the church and international community would protect his community if they remained peaceful. He was wrong, and his faith would cost him his life and the lives of 44 others. Another key figure in Acteal's Las Abejas community was a catechist named Lorenzo Vázquez Pérez, 38 years old, who'd been trained by Bishop Ruiz's diocese to lead religious education and community organization. Lorenzo was taller than most Tzotzil men, about 5'8", thin, with hands that shook slightly from a childhood bout with what was probably typhoid fever, but had never been properly diagnosed because indigenous communities didn't have access to doctors. Lorenzo wore wire-rimmed glasses he'd bought at a market in San Cristobal. Prescription wrong, but better than nothing, gave him a scholarly appearance unusual in a community where literacy was rare. What Lorenzo valued most was education. He believed that indigenous children deserved schools that taught in their own language, that respected their culture, that provided tools to navigate the modern world without abandoning indigenous identity. He'd organized informal schools in Acteal and surrounding communities, teaching children to read and write in Tzotzil and Spanish, teaching them about their rights under Mexican law, teaching them that poverty wasn't God's will, but human injustice that could be challenged and changed. Lorenzo's educational work made him a target. The government viewed indigenous education in indigenous languages as separatist, as preparing the ground for Zapatista ideology. The paramilitaries viewed him as a subversive, teaching children to question authority, to demand rights that threatened the social order that kept indigenous people subordinate. On December 10, 1997, 12 days before the massacre, Lorenzo received a visit at his home from three men he recognized as members of Máscara Roja, the local paramilitary group. The men told him he needed to stop teaching, needed to stop organizing Las Abejas meetings, needed to leave Acteal or face consequences. "What consequences?" Lorenzo asked. One of the men, a neighbor Lorenzo had known since childhood, said quietly, "The kind where your wife becomes a widow and your children become orphans." Lorenzo told the men he was a man of peace, that he would continue his work because it was God's work, that violence solved nothing. The men left, but the message was clear. Las Abejas members in Acteal were marked for elimination. The paramilitary group Máscara Roja was formed in 1995, approximately 1 year after the Zapatista uprising, under the sponsorship of local PRI political bosses in the municipality of Chenalho. The paramilitaries were recruited from indigenous communities, mostly young Tzotzil men who were offered money, weapons, and protection from prosecution in exchange for attacking communities that refused to declare loyalty to the PRI or that were sympathetic to Zapatista demands. The formation of Máscara Roja followed a pattern repeated across Chiapas in the mid-1990s. Local PRI officials identified young men who were economically desperate, who had grievances against neighbors over land disputes or family conflicts, who could be recruited to violence with the right combination of payment and impunity. These men were then trained by active-duty Mexican military personnel, not officially, but through informal arrangements where soldiers would visit communities, provide weapons training, tactical instruction, and, crucially, the message that attacking Las Abejas communities would not result in prosecution because the government supported their activities. By December 1997, Máscara Roja had approximately 80 active members in and around Chenalho municipality, armed with AR-15 rifles, AK-47s, and high-powered hunting rifles. The weapons came from government sources, either directly provided by military units or purchased with money provided by PRI officials, then claimed to have been bought independently. The paramilitaries operated openly, wore distinctive red bandanas, hence the name Red Mask, traveled in groups, and made no secret of their intention to cleanse the region of Zapatista sympathizers. The commander of Máscara Roja in Chenalho was a man named Jacinto Arias Cruz, 35 years old, Tzotzil, born in the same highlands region where Las Abejas members lived. Jacinto had grown up poor like everyone else, had tried migrating to work in northern Mexico, returned to Chiapas no better off, and in 1995 had been recruited to the paramilitaries with the promise of 150 pesos monthly, about $200 at 1997 exchange rates, more than he could earn farming or doing manual labor. Jacinto was of medium height, around 5'6", stocky from a diet slightly better than most indigenous peoples because of his paramilitary salary, with a scar across his left cheek from a machete fight when he was younger. His most distinctive feature was his eyes, hard, flat, showing the emotional shutdown that comes from doing terrible things repeatedly until empathy becomes a luxury you can't afford. What Jacinto valued most was power. Growing up indigenous in Chiapas meant being powerless, ordered around by mestizo landowners, cheated by merchants, ignored by government, living in a hierarchy where being Maya meant being at the bottom. The paramilitaries offered him a chance to reverse that, to have weapons and authority, to make others afraid of him instead of being afraid himself. He embraced it completely. Jacinto had participated in multiple attacks on Las Abejas communities throughout 1997. In March, his group had burned houses in a village called Pueblo Nuevo. In June, they'd ambushed a group of Las Abejas members traveling to a meeting, killing 2. In October, they'd attacked a wake being held for an elderly woman, beating mourners and destroying the house. Each time, there'd been no consequences, no arrests, no investigations, no government response except statements that these were intercommunal conflicts that indigenous communities needed to resolve themselves. By December 1997, Jacinto and Mascara Roja had received authorization from their handlers, PRI officials in Chenalho, and military contacts who coordinated paramilitary operations to conduct a major operation against Las Abejas in Acteal. The authorization was verbal, never written, deniable if things went wrong, but the message was clear. Las Abejas was growing too confident, needed to be taught a lesson that would break their organization and demonstrate to other communities what happened when you refused to support the government. The timing was strategic. December 22nd was close enough to Christmas that international attention would be minimal. Journalists were on holiday, diplomats were out of office, human rights observers were back in their home countries. The attack could be carried out, the bodies could be buried, and by the time anyone paid attention, the massacre would be presented as just another tragic episode of indigenous violence in a complicated conflict that outsiders couldn't understand. On December 21, 1997, approximately 60 members of Las Abejas from Acteal and surrounding villages gathered at Acteal's small church. Really just a chapel, a wooden structure with a corrugated metal roof and benches made from rough-cut planks. They'd come to begin a 3-day religious fast and prayer vigil for peace in Chiapas. The fast was a regular Las Abejas practice, abstaining from food, spending days in prayer, seeking spiritual strength to continue their nonviolent resistance. The group included men, women, children, infants. Families had come together because Las Abejas was family-oriented. When parents fasted and prayed, children participated. Some women had brought infants still nursing, too young to be left at home, wrapped in colorful woven shawls in the traditional Maya style. The group planned to spend 3 days praying, singing hymns, reading scripture, and discussing how to maintain their pacifist witness in an increasingly violent context. They knew about threats. Everyone in Las Abejas knew that Mascara Roja was targeting them. There'd been warnings, threats, previous attacks, but they'd decided that gathering for prayer was their right, that the church was sacred space that even paramilitaries would respect, and that their faith demanded witness even in the face of danger. Alonso Vázquez Gómez addressed the group on the evening of December 21st as they gathered in the church for the first night of prayer. He spoke in Tzotzil, his voice carrying in the small space. We are here to pray for peace, to ask God to change the hearts of those who hate us, to witness that another way is possible. They say we must choose between the government and the Zapatistas, but we choose neither violence nor submission. We choose the path of Christ, who faced his enemies without weapons, who suffered rather than caused suffering. Some of you are afraid. I understand. I am afraid too. But we cannot let fear silence our witness. If we scatter, if we hide, if we abandon our faith, then they have already won. The group sang a hymn in Tzotzil, voices blending in harmonies that reflected centuries of Maya musical tradition adapted to Catholic worship. Then they settled into prayer, some sitting on the church benches, others on the floor, families clustered together, everyone beginning the fast that would, for 45 of them, end not in spiritual renewal, but in massacre. While Las Abejas prayed, Mascara Roja prepared. On the afternoon of December 21st, approximately 60 paramilitaries gathered at a ranch about 5 kilometers from Acteal. The ranch belonged to a PRI supporter who allowed paramilitaries to use his property for meetings and staging. Jacinto Arias Cruz addressed the group, explaining the plan. They would attack tomorrow morning, December 22nd. Las Abejas would be gathered at the church in Acteal for their prayer fast, grouped together easy targets. The attack would be systematic, surround the church, fire into the group, pursue anyone who fled, eliminate everyone. No survivors who could identify attackers or provide testimony about what happened. Make it look like a battle, like both sides had fought, to support the government's narrative about intercommunal violence. What about the children? One of the younger paramilitaries asked. Jacinto looked at him with contempt. You think Las Abejas worry about our children when they refuse to join us? You think the Zapatistas they support would spare your family? No survivors. That's the order. Everyone dies. Men, women, children, everyone. That's how you send a message that lasts. The paramilitaries checked their weapons, distributed ammunition. Most had AR-15 or AK-47 rifles, semi-automatic, capable of firing 30-round magazines as fast as you could pull the trigger. Some had hunting rifles, older bolt-action weapons, but sufficient for the task. A few had machetes for close work, if it came to that. They drank posh, homemade corn liquor to build courage, to dull whatever conscience remained, to prepare themselves for what they were about to do. The local Mexican Army unit stationed at a base in nearby Mejamut, approximately 200 meters from where the massacre would occur, was notified that an operation would take place the next day. The notification was informal, not written, just a message through channels that military personnel should remain at their base, should not respond to gunfire, should not interfere with what was about to happen. The military's role was to provide security by ensuring nobody stopped the massacre while it was happening. At 8 p.m. on December 21st, a PRI official from Chenalho municipal government visited the Army base, met with the commanding officer, name still classified, and confirmed that tomorrow's operation had government approval at state level, that there would be no consequences for the perpetrators or for military personnel who failed to intervene. The commanding officer acknowledged the message. He would later testify that he'd received unclear orders and had interpreted them as requiring his unit to remain at their base to avoid being drawn into intercommunal violence. This interpretation required him to ignore the sound of sustained gunfire 200 meters away and the screams of people being massacred. At 7:30 a.m. on December 22, 1997, approximately 45 members of Las Abejas were in and around the small church in Acteal. They'd spent the night in prayer, had slept little, were in the second day of their fast. The morning was cold, fog still hanging in the valleys, the sun not yet high enough to warm the air. Women were preparing hot drinks for children, not food, but water boiled with some herbs to warm them while maintaining the fast. Some of the men were outside the church, talking quietly. Most people were inside, seated on benches or on the floor, wrapped in blankets or shawls against the cold, praying or singing softly. Lorenzo Vasquez Perez was leading a prayer, reading from the Gospel of Matthew in Spanish, translating into Tzotzil as he read, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." At 7:42 a.m., the first gunfire came from the hillside above the church. Single shots initially, then sustained automatic fire. The sound was enormous, echoing across the valley, unmistakable. Not firecrackers, not celebration, but sustained rifle fire targeting the church and the people inside and around it. The Las Abejas members reacted with confusion initially, then panic. People who'd been outside ran toward the church, thinking it offered protection. People inside tried to take cover behind benches or press themselves against the walls. Parents covered children with their bodies. Everyone was screaming, crying, praying, the sounds mixing with gunfire in a chaos that nobody could process or understand. Mascara Roja attacked from multiple positions, approximately 60 paramilitaries positioned on the hillside above the church and along paths that led away from it, creating a killing zone with no escape. They fired methodically, not spraying bullets wildly, but aiming, picking targets, the military training evident in how they established fields of fire and ensured no escape routes remained open. Alonso Vázquez Gómez, the 52-year-old leader of Las Abejas in Acteal, was outside the church when the shooting started. He was hit by multiple bullets within the first 30 seconds, 3 rounds entering his chest, 1 through his abdomen, 1 through his neck. He died almost instantly, collapsing in front of the church entrance, his blood pooling on the earth, while people inside screamed and prayed and waited to die. Lorenzo Vázquez Perez, the catechist who'd been reading scripture, tried to shield children near him when bullets tore through the church's wooden walls. He was shot 4 times, twice in the back, once in the left shoulder, once in the head. The head shot killed him, but he remained upright for several seconds, held up by the crowd of people pressed together in the small space before sliding to the floor. Some Las Abejas members tried to flee. They ran from the church, ran down the hillside away from the shooting, families running together, parents carrying children, elderly people struggling to keep pace. The paramilitaries pursued them, hunting them through the cornfields and forest below the church, shooting people as they ran, executing wounded who'd fallen, methodically eliminating everyone they could find. A woman named Marcela Capote Vázquez, 32 years old, ran from the church carrying her 2 children, a 4-year-old boy and a baby girl, not yet 1 year old. She made it about 100 meters before a paramilitary caught up to her. He shot her in the back. She fell forward trying to protect the children as she fell. The paramilitary shot her twice more, then shot both children, execution-style bullets to the head, while they lay beside their mother's body. An elderly man named Victorio Vázquez Luna, 68 years old, too old to run, knelt in front of the church with his hands raised, praying aloud in Tzotzil, asking God to receive his spirit. A paramilitary walked up to him, rifle aimed at his head, and said in Tzotzil, "Your God isn't here today, old man," then fired once. Victorio's body fell backward, his hands still raised in prayer. Inside the church, the massacre was systematic. Paramilitaries entered through the door and through gaps in the walls where boards had come loose. They fired into the crowd at close range, less than 5 meters, sometimes less than 2 meters. At that range, the high-powered rifle bullets didn't just wound, they destroyed human bodies, tearing through tissue and bone, often passing through one person and hitting another behind them. A 17-year-old girl named Rosa Perez Perez was killed while trying to protect her younger siblings, ages 9 and 6. All 3 were shot, the bullets hitting them while they huddled together against the church wall. A pregnant woman named Veronica Vázquez Tones, 8 months pregnant, was shot multiple times in the abdomen and chest. She died along with her unborn child, her body found later with her hands still on her belly in a final protective gesture. The children's deaths were particularly horrific. The paramilitaries made no distinction between armed adults, none of the Las Abejas members were armed, and infants. Children were shot while clinging to parents, while hiding under benches, while running, while begging for their lives. The youngest victim was a 3-month-old baby girl named Juana Perez Perez, shot while wrapped in a shawl on her mother's back. The bullet passed through the mother first, killing her, then killed the baby. They were found together, the baby still in the shawl, both dead. The massacre lasted approximately 4.5 hours. Not continuous shooting for that entire time, but waves of attack punctuated by pauses as paramilitaries reloaded, as they searched for survivors hiding in the forest, as they returned to the church to ensure everyone inside was dead. Witnesses who survived by hiding in the forest reported hearing not just gunfire, but screaming, begging, prayers, and laughter. The paramilitaries were laughing, celebrating, treating the massacre as sport or entertainment. At approximately 12:15 p.m., the shooting finally stopped. Mascara Roja conducted a final sweep, checking bodies to ensure no survivors, executing wounded who were still breathing. Then they collected their shell casings, though they missed hundreds, and withdrew from Acteal, moving back toward the ranch where they'd staged, confident that no consequences would follow because they'd been assured of government protection. They left behind 45 bodies, 21 women, 15 children, ranging from 3 months to 15 years old, and 9 men. The bodies were scattered, some in the church, some outside it, some scattered down the hillside where people had tried to flee. Many had been shot multiple times, suggesting executions rather than combat. Some showed signs of close-range headshots, confirming that wounded had been finished off deliberately. The Mexican Army unit stationed 200 meters away, close enough that they absolutely heard the gunfire, the screaming, the hours-long massacre, did nothing. They remained at their base. They didn't investigate, didn't respond, didn't intervene. Their commanding officer would later claim he thought it was intercommunal fighting that his unit shouldn't interfere with. This excuse required believing that 4.5 hours of sustained gunfire was normal community conflict not requiring military response. The survivors of Acteal, approximately 20 people who'd hidden in the forest or who'd managed to flee before the paramilitaries arrived, remained in hiding for hours after the shooting stopped, terrified that the attackers might return. Around 3 p.m., some began approaching the church, calling out to see if anyone was alive, finding only bodies and the overwhelming smell of blood and gunpowder and death. One survivor, a man named Antonio Vasquez Luna, who'd been working in his cornfield when the attack began and had hidden when he heard the shooting, described what he found when he returned to Acteal around 4 p.m. The church was full of blood. Bodies everywhere, on the benches, on the floor, piled against the walls, where people had tried to find protection, children dead in their mothers' arms, old people shot where they knelt, praying. I found my wife and 2 of my children. They'd been shot, my wife 6 times, my son 5 times, my daughter 3 times. My 9-year-old daughter was still alive somehow, hit in the shoulder and leg, but alive. She was the only one I found breathing in that church. Everyone else was dead. Antonio carried his wounded daughter down the mountain toward the nearest clinic, a journey of over 3 hours on foot because there were no roads passable by vehicle. By the time he arrived, his daughter had died in his arms from blood loss. He was the only survivor from his family. News of the massacre spread slowly. Survivors who could travel made their way to San Cristobal de las Casas, arriving throughout the afternoon and evening of December 22nd, telling their stories to Bishop Ruiz's diocese staff, to human rights organizations, to anyone who would listen. But it was late afternoon on December 22nd. Christmas was 3 days away. Government offices were closed. Journalists were preparing for holidays, and the initial reports seemed almost unbelievable in their scale. The Mexican government's first response came on the evening of December 22nd. The Chiapas state government issued a brief statement acknowledging an incident of intercommunal violence in Acteal, Chinalho municipality with some casualties. The statement claimed that indigenous groups had clashed over land disputes and religious differences between Catholics and Protestants, a completely false claim. All the victims were Catholic. The statement suggested that government was investigating, but that the situation was complex and that outsiders shouldn't rush to judgment about what had happened. This narrative, intercommunal violence, religious conflict, both sides to blame, would be the government's position for the next several days until forensic evidence and witness testimony made it impossible to maintain. On December 23rd, journalists and human rights observers began arriving in Acteal. What they found was undeniable: a massacre, not a battle, bodies showing execution-style wounds, no weapons found with the victims, survivors with consistent stories about paramilitaries attacking unarmed people at prayer, shell casings from high-powered rifles, not the kind of weapons subsistence farmers owned, and the proximity of the army base, close enough that military personnel must have heard everything. The bodies were documented, photographed, examined by forensic experts from the Mexican Attorney General's office who'd been forced to respond to growing media attention. The forensic evidence was damning. Most victims had been shot multiple times, many showing close-range wounds suggesting executions. 15 children killed, including 4 under age 5. 21 women killed, 4 of them pregnant. All shot, none showing signs of having been armed or having fought back. International reaction was swift and horrified. The United Nations issued a statement condemning the massacre and demanding immediate investigation. The European Union called for accountability. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, described Acteal as a potential crime against humanity. The Mexican government, facing unprecedented international scrutiny, was forced to respond more seriously than it had intended. On December 26th, President Ernesto Zedillo addressed the nation, expressed sorrow for the tragic events in Acteal, promised full investigation, and announced that several arrests had been made. But his statement still avoided calling it a massacre, still suggested it was community violence that had gotten out of control rather than state-sponsored terrorism. The investigation of the Acteal Massacre was compromised from the beginning. The Mexican government had every incentive to minimize the massacre, to obscure state involvement, to prevent the investigation from implicating military personnel or PRI officials who'd supported the paramilitaries. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in how governments protect themselves while appearing to pursue justice. Between December 26, 1997 and March 1998, Mexican authorities arrested 87 people in connection with the massacre. The arrests were a mix of actual perpetrators and convenient scapegoats, designed to demonstrate that the government was acting decisively while avoiding accountability for state involvement. Of the 87 arrested, approximately 45 were members of Máscara Roja who'd participated directly in the attack. About 20 were alleged accomplices, people who'd provided support or intelligence. The remaining 22 were largely innocent people, arrested to inflate numbers and create the impression of a thorough investigation. The trials began in 1999 and dragged on for years. Of the 87 originally arrested, 47 were convicted of murder and related crimes, receiving sentences from 25 to 35 years. 26 were acquitted due to insufficient evidence or procedural irregularities. 14 had their cases dismissed before trial. The convictions focused on the paramilitaries who'd pulled triggers and swung machetes. but the investigation conspicuously failed to pursue higher-level responsibility. The PRI officials who'd provided weapons and coordination for the paramilitaries were never charged. The military officers who'd ordered their units not to intervene were never prosecuted. The state government officials who'd authorized the operation were never investigated. Most significantly, in 2009, 12 years after the massacre, the Mexican Supreme Court overturned 20 of the convictions, ruling that evidence had been obtained improperly and that defendants' due process rights had been violated. The released prisoners included some who'd participated directly in the massacre. The Supreme Court ruling was legally defensible but politically convenient, allowing the government to release perpetrators while claiming respect for rule of law. By 2020, fewer than 15 people remained in prison for the Acteal Massacre. Most had served between 12 and 18 years before being released on parole or having their convictions overturned. None of the paramilitary commanders, none of the PRI officials, none of the military personnel involved faced any consequences whatsoever. Jacinto Arias Cruz, the Máscara Roja commander who'd led the attack, was convicted in 2000 and sentenced to 35 years. He served 11 years before being released in 2011 after his conviction was overturned on procedural grounds. He returned to Chenalho municipality, where he lives today, never having expressed remorse or acknowledged his role in planning and executing the massacre of 45 people, including 15 children. The families of the Acteal victims faced not only grief, but complete abandonment by the state. Most victims had been primary breadwinners or essential contributors to family survival. Their deaths left widows, orphans, and elderly parents without support in communities where no social safety nets existed. Antonio Vázquez Luna, who lost his wife and both his children, became one of the most vocal survivors demanding justice. He testified in trials, spoke to journalists, addressed international human rights forums. His entire life became dedicated to ensuring Acteal wasn't forgotten, that the dead were remembered, that the government was held accountable. In a 2007 interview, he said, "I lost everything on December 22, 1997. My wife, my children, my reason for living. The government took them from me, not just the paramilitaries who pulled triggers, but the officials who armed them, the military who listened to them die and did nothing, the politicians who still deny what happened. I will speak about Acteal until I die. It's the only thing I can do for my family now." Antonio died in 2018 at age 59, worn out by 2 decades of grief and fighting for justice that never fully came. His funeral was attended by hundreds of Las Abejas members who viewed him as a martyr to the cause of truth and accountability. The children who survived Acteal, orphans who'd watched their parents murdered, children who'd hidden while their siblings were executed, grew up with profound trauma. Most never received psychological treatment because such services didn't exist in indigenous communities and because families couldn't afford them. Many struggled with PTSD, depression, survivor's guilt. Some turned to alcohol or drugs as coping mechanisms. Some committed suicide, unable to live with memories of what they'd witnessed. A girl named Juana Perez Vázquez, who was 8 years old during the massacre and survived by hiding under a pile of bodies while pretending to be dead, spent her childhood and adolescence trying to process what she'd experienced. She'd laid beneath her dead mother for over 2 hours, while paramilitaries searched for survivors, feeling her mother's blood soaking through her clothes, listening to gunshots as other wounded were finished off. She was found alive when survivors returned after the attackers had left, physically uninjured but psychologically destroyed. In a 2017 interview, 28-year-old Juana said, "I'm still under those bodies. Every day I'm still there. I smell the blood. I feel the weight. I hear the screaming. People tell me to move on, to heal, to forgive. But how do you forgive people who murdered your mother while you hid beneath her? How do you heal from that? You don't. You just exist, half alive, waiting to die so you can be with the people you lost." The Acteal Massacre became a defining moment in Mexico's relationship with its indigenous population, exposing the brutal reality behind government rhetoric about respecting indigenous rights and cultures. The massacre demonstrated that when indigenous communities organized to demand autonomy or justice, the state response could be systematic elimination disguised as intercommunal conflict. The massacre didn't end paramilitary violence in Chiapas, it accelerated it. Following Acteal, the government became more careful about avoiding massacres large enough to generate international attention, but the paramilitary strategy continued. Between 1998 and 2006, at least 200 more indigenous activists were killed in Chiapas, usually in small incidents that didn't make international news, didn't trigger investigations, didn't produce accountability. Las Abejas survived as an organization, but was permanently traumatized. Membership declined from 10,000 before Acteal to around 5,000 by 2000. The organization continued its pacifist witness, but with the understanding that nonviolence offered no protection, that the government would tolerate their existence only as long as they remained powerless and unthreatening. The Catholic Church, specifically Bishop Samuel Ruiz, became a target for government harassment after Acteal. Ruiz was accused of supporting the Zapatistas, of encouraging indigenous rebellion, of manipulating communities for political purposes. The Vatican, under pressure from the Mexican government, forced Ruiz to retire in 2000, replacing him with a less politically active bishop. Ruiz spent his retirement continuing to work with indigenous communities, died in 2011 at age 86, mourned by thousands who viewed him as the one church figure who genuinely stood with indigenous people even when it cost him. At Acteal itself, where 45 people were massacred during prayer, a memorial was constructed in 2001 with funding from international donors and Las Abejas. The memorial includes 45 white crosses, each bearing a name and age, arranged on the hillside where many victims fell. The church where the massacre occurred was never rebuilt. It stands as ruins, deliberately preserved as physical evidence of what happened. Walls still marked with bullet holes, bloodstains still visible on the floor despite rain and time. Every December 22nd, survivors and Las Abejas members gather at Acteal for a memorial ceremony. The numbers have declined. Fewer than 50 people attend now, compared to hundreds in the first years after the massacre. The survivors are aging, dying, and younger generations have moved away, unable to live in a place so marked by trauma. But some remain. An elderly woman named Cristina Perez Mendez, who lost her husband and 3 children at Acteal, attends every year. She's now in her 80s, barely able to walk, but she comes to stand at the memorial and say the names of her dead family. In 2022, on the 25th anniversary, she spoke to a journalist. "People ask why I come back here, why I don't leave this place with so many bad memories. But this is where my family died. This is where they prayed for peace and were murdered for it. If I leave, if everyone leaves, then the government wins. Then Acteal becomes just another place, just another story, just another forgotten massacre. I come here to say this happened. My family died here. The government murdered them, and I will not let anyone forget." The Acteal Massacre forces impossible questions about state violence, about the limits of nonviolent resistance, about what happens when governments view indigenous demands for justice as threats requiring elimination rather than as legitimate grievances requiring response. The 45 people who died at Acteal weren't rebels or guerrillas. They were pacifists, explicitly committed to nonviolence, organized through the Catholic Church, doing nothing more dangerous than praying and demanding their basic human rights. They believed that moral witness would protect them, that international community would notice and respond, that even the Mexican government wouldn't massacre people at prayer in a church. They were wrong. And their deaths demonstrated that the Mexican government viewed indigenous organization, even pacifist organization, as threatening enough to warrant elimination. The paramilitaries who carried out the massacre were tools, but the massacre was policy, part of a broader counterinsurgency strategy that used indigenous people to kill other indigenous people while the government maintained plausible deniability. The failure of justice after Acteal was as significant as the massacre itself. Minimal prosecutions, overturned convictions, no accountability for state officials, and a government that continued denying the full truth of what happened. The message was clear. Indigenous lives were expendable. Massacring indigenous people at prayer was wrong in theory, but not wrong enough to justify disrupting the political and economic structures that benefited from indigenous exploitation and marginalization. And the uncomfortable truth is that Acteal wasn't unique. It was unusual in its scale and in the international attention it received, but the pattern, indigenous communities organizing for rights, paramilitaries attacking them, government denying responsibility, minimal consequences, repeated throughout Mexico and Latin America. Acteal was just the massacre that couldn't be completely hidden. If this story made you think about state violence against indigenous peoples, about the failure of justice systems to protect marginalized communities, and about how governments use paramilitaries to avoid accountability for political violence, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that expose how power operates when it believes the world isn't watching. Comment below, how do communities pursue justice when their governments are complicit in massacring them? What does it mean to be pacifist in a context where the state will kill you whether you're peaceful or not? Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always masked men with guns. Sometimes they're government officials who arm those men, military officers who hear massacres and do nothing, politicians who deny atrocities, and justice systems that free murderers on procedural technicalities. The 45 people who died at Acteal believed that prayer and peace would protect them. They were murdered for that belief, and the world briefly noticed, then looked away, then forgot, which is exactly what governments committing massacres hope will happen every single time.